Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're finally getting our first look at some affordable LGA 1700 motherboards designed to support Intel's latest generation Alder Lake processors. Perhaps more specifically, the new locked non-K models, such as the Core i7-12700 that I have on hand today for testing. And I also have on hand for testing is the new, creatively named RM1 box cooler. So quite a few things to go over, but let's start by talking about motherboards. As usual, MSI has been on their game and they've sent over the MAG B660M Mortar Wi-Fi DDR4. And as it stands, this is the only B660 motherboard we have on hand for testing. So we are very happy to have it. The rest of Intel's partners seem to have forgotten that this launch is even happening. But no matter, the B660M Mortar Wi-Fi DDR4 is a great starting point and is ideal for showing off the new Core i7-12700. Speaking of which, let's start by quickly going over the 9 new 65-watt parts minus the F variants, of which there are 4. The only Core i9 model is the 12900, and when compared to the 12900K, it's clocked just 100 MHz lower, and this drops the maximum turbo power rating from 241 watts down to just 202 watts. That's a significant 16% reduction in power usage for just a 2 to 2.5% drop in frequency. There's also just a single Core i7 model, the 12700, which we'll be testing today, and it's clocked just 100 MHz lower than the K SKU for the P cores, but 200 MHz lower for the E cores. This sees the maximum power drop from 190 watts to 80 watts, so not really a big change there. Then for the Core i5s, we have 3 new models, which includes the 12600, 12500, and the 12400, and apparently the only F SKU will be the 12400F. The 12400s clock up to 4.4 GHz, the 12500 4.6 GHz, and the 12600 4.8 GHz, which is just 100 MHz below the 12600K. Now, the parts that we can consider to be truly new are the Core i3s, Pentium, and Celeron models. There are 2 Core i3s, the 12300 and the 12100. Both pack 4 P cores plus SMT support with no E cores, with a 12 MB L3 cache. The 12300, that clocks up to 4.4 GHz, while the 12100 clocks to 4.3 GHz, and that model is available as an F SKU. Then we have the Pentium Gold G7400. Now this is a dual core, so 2 P cores with 4 threads, as it does support SMT technology, but there are no E cores. It has a 6 MB L3 cache and it runs at just 3.7 GHz. Then finally, the Celeron G6900. This is a lowly dual core, packing just 2 P cores with no SMT support. So it's a 2-core, 2-thread processor with a 4 MB L3 cache running at 4.3 GHz. So this is a web browsing and email edition Alder Lake processor. Now for the chipsets, we're getting B660, which we'll be looking at today, along with H670 and H610. So with Z690, that means there's 4 600 series chipsets and all support integrated Intel Wi-Fi 6E, Intel Rapid Storage Technology 19, and PCI Express 4.0. Focusing on the B660, since that's what we'll be testing today, when compared to Z690, it is quite heavily cut down, which I suppose makes sense. And of course, Intel being true to form, CPU overclocking is off the table with any of these cut down chipsets, but at least you can overclock the memory, which is more useful these days. From the CPU, just 4 DMI Gen 4 lanes are supported, essentially halving the PCI Express 4.0 connectivity when compared to Z690. But I don't feel like this will be an issue for most users. But this does mean that the chipset PCI Express 4.0 lanes have been slashed from 12 to 6, while the PCIe 3.0 lanes have been reduced from 16 to 8. As for the USB ports, there's half as many 3.2 20 gigabits per second ports at just 2. The potential 10 gigabits per second ports have been slashed from 10 to 4, and the 5 gigabits per second ports from 10 to 6. The only other noteworthy feature is PCIe RAID, which isn't supported on B660 or B610 boards. Now, whereas the default power mode for K-SKU CPUs sees them maintain the maximum turbo power or PL2 state indefinitely, so PL1 equals PL2, the locked processors like the Core i7-12700 work as previous generations have. That means the PL2 is a temporary boost state, and after a certain period of time, the CPU drops to PL1, which in the case of the 12700 is 65 watts. That said, as always with Intel, this is a complex and messy process that's anything but consumer friendly. Basically, Intel fixed this issue for the K SKUs, but with these locked parts, the power usage is all over the place. For example, if you install the 12700 on any Z690 motherboard, with maybe the exception of some entry-level ASRock models, it will run in the PL2 state indefinitely, so maximum power there, despite the fact that this is a locked part. But making matters worse is the fact that this can also happen on some B660, H670, and H610 boards. For example, the MSI B660M Mortar Wi-Fi DDR4 runs without any power limits by default. And this means that the 12700 can consume as much power as it likes on the B660M Mortar, and typically this should see package power up around 180 watts. But if you were to install it on some of the more entry-level B660 motherboards, the default there would likely be for PL2 to hit 180 watts for a limited period of time before dropping to PL1, so 65 watts. What that does to clock speeds depends on the workload, and for today's review, I'll be testing the 12700 at the maximum power state, as well as the 65 watt spec. In short though, this means that the 12700 could be over 30% faster on some B660 boards, depending on the power state, and this mess gets even worse if you use a K-SKU CPU with a 125 watt base spec. Anyway, we'll probably dive more into this in future content. For now, let's go over the test system. For this one, I haven't done any DDR5 testing. That just seems like a waste of time right now, and we really know all we need to in terms of DDR4 versus DDR5 performance. You can either refer to our day one Core i9-12700K review, or my more recently released DDR4 versus DDR5 content covering 41 games. So, for testing the Core i7-12700, I'm using the MSI B660M Mortar Wi-Fi DDR4 with 32GB of dual-rank, dual-channel DDR4 3200CL14 memory. So the same stuff I use for all of my DDR4 testing, and it is typically faster than single-rank DDR4 3800 CL18 memory in terms of performance. The K-SKU Alder Lake CPUs, they've been tested on the MSI Z690 Tomahawk Wi-Fi DDR4 using the same memory, and all boards were updated to the latest BIOS revision. I've also updated my Ryzen data using the MSI X570S Tomahawk Wi-Fi motherboard. I should also note that all gaming data has been updated for the AM4 and LGA1700 CPUs with resizable bar enabled. The plan was to do the same with the Intel 10th and 11th gen core processors as well, but performance went backwards in all instances with rebar enabled, so for now I've left this PCI Express feature disabled on those platforms. Finally, the last test system notes worth mentioning is the fact that all application and gaming data has been collected using the AMD Radeon RX 6900 XT graphics card, and the operating system of choice was Windows 11. Okay, I think that covers everything. Let's dive into the results. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core results, we find that the 12700 is capable of producing a score of 21,407 points when paired with a quality cooler on a B660 motherboard, and that meant it was just 6% slower than the 12700K. Moreover, it also meant that it was able to match the Ryzen 9 5900X while crushing the older Core i9 10900K. Now, when using the RM1 box cooler without any power limits, the 12700 was thermally limited to a score of 19,714 points, so an 8% reduction when compared to what we saw with the Corsair H170i. Then finally, with the 65 watt spec enforced, the score dropped to 16,017 points, which is a similar level of performance to that of the Ryzen 7 5800X and Core i9 10900K, so very respectable given how little power the 12700 is using here. Now, when it comes to single core performance, power and thermal limits aren't an issue, as the 12700 can clock to 4.9 GHz using the RM1 box cooler within the 65 watt power budget. As a result, all three configurations delivered similar performance, and this meant the 12700 was just 3% slower than the 12700K, making it a massive 16% faster than the Ryzen 9 5900X. Moving on, we find that the 7-zip file manager compression performance is much the same regardless of the cooling and power configuration, suggesting that utilization isn't very high here. And the same is also true for the decompression results. Basically, regardless of the configuration used, the 12700 is comparable to the Core i9 10900K and only 4% slower than the K variant. Next up, we have the Corona benchmark, and again we find that with an upgraded cooler, the 12700 is able to basically match the 12700K, taking just 3% longer to complete the workload. Then with the stock RM1 cooler, but with no power limits, performance is thermally limited, increasing the render time to 77 seconds, so a 13% increase in completion time. Then with the 65-watt spec enforced, the render time blows out to 88 seconds, so an almost 30% increase in render time when compared to the H170i configuration. That said, we're still looking at comparable performance to that of the Ryzen 7 5800X and Core i7-11700. The Adobe Premiere Pro workload is a mix of single and multi-core tasks. Using the H170i liquid cooler, the 12700 was just 2.5% slower than the 12700K, so a great result there. And we find that using the box cooler only reduced performance by 2%, so still a very respectable result overall. Power limiting the 12700 to the 65-watt spec saw the score fall to 723 points, which is a 14% reduction from the H170i configuration, and again this placed the 12700 on par with the 5800X. Moving on to the Photoshop results, and here we have an application that for the most part relies on single core performance. Therefore, thermal and power headroom is really a non-issue, as you can max out a single core within the 65-watt power budget, and the RM1 easily deals with that thermal load. It also meant that the 12700 was just 2% slower than the 12700K in this test. The last Adobe application that we've tested with is After Effects, and like Photoshop, this program largely relies on single core performance. So using the H170i, the 12700 basically matched the 12700K, while the power limited 65-watt spec using the RM1 cooler reduced the score by just 4%. So a negligible difference really, and it meant that the 12700 still scored better than even the Ryzen 9 5900X, which is very impressive. Once again, I'm including Factorio in the application benchmarks, as we're not measuring FPS but rather updates per second. This automated benchmark calculates the time it takes to run 1,000 updates, and this is a single-threaded test which apparently relies heavily on cache performance. The 12700 performed much the same regardless of the cooler and power state, and again this is due to the single-core nature of this test. It was 7% slower than the 12700K, but still managed to outperform the Ryzen 9 5900X, so again a great result for Intel's new locked Core i7 part. When it comes to code compilation performance, the Core i7 12700 is a beast, at least when paired with an upgraded cooler. Taking just 4,058 seconds meant it was basically matching the 12-core Ryzen 9 5950X, and it took just 4% longer than the 12700K. Then thermally limited with the RM1, it took just 5% longer to complete the workload, and then 28% longer once running at the 65-watt spec. But even here, it was still able to roughly match the Core i9 11900K, so an impressive result in terms of efficiency. The last application benchmark we're going to look at is Blender, and these margins are similar to what we've seen in a number of core-heavy benchmarks already. Without any thermal limits, the 12700 basically matches the 12700K, and when thermally limited with the RM1 box cooler, the render time only increased by 12%. That said, this time the 65-watt spec did heavily reduce performance, increasing the render time by a massive 46%, making the 12700 one of the slowest CPUs tested. And this is due to the use of AVX instructions, which just blows out the power budget, and therefore heavily reduces the frequency at which the cores can operate when limited to a package power of 65 watts. Now, when measuring total system power usage, we see that the 12700 consumes slightly less power with the H170i when compared to the RM1, despite the fact that the liquid cooler does enable a higher level of performance. I believe this is due to the fact that with the box cooler, the CPU quickly hits the thermal threshold of just over 100 degrees, and with the cooler unable to efficiently extract that much heat, much of it ends up being dumped into the PCB, and this increases VRM temperatures, reducing the VRM's efficiency, and therefore pushes total system usage higher. Alright, time to check out some gaming performance, and we'll start with F1 2021. The 12700 was within 1% of the 12700K when looking at the average frame rate, and with almost 400 FPS on average, it's fair to say that performance is more than sufficient here. Even with the 65-watt spec enforced, the 12700 still averaged 364 FPS, which was just a 7% dip from the H170i configuration. It also meant when power limited, the 12700 was able to match the 10900K and 11900K. The Core i7-12700 also performed really well in Rainbow Six Siege with 566 FPS on average, so the same level of performance seen from the 12700K. Again, in the 65 watt mode, the 12700 was just 7% slower, and while that did make the Ryzen 7 5800X faster, we're talking about over 500 FPS on average. So how much those margins matter is hard to say. Interestingly, the margins in Watch Dogs Legion are a lot smaller, and here we're dropping just 5% with the 65 watt mode, limiting the 12700 to 5900X and 5800X light performance. But with the power limits removed and the H170i installed, the 12700 was just 2 FPS slower than the 12700K, so basically identical performance then. Next up, we have a shot of the Tomb Raider, and here the 12700 managed to match the 12700K with 186 FPS on average, and with the RM1 box cooler installed, performance only dropped by 2%. Then with the 65 watt spec, performance again dropped by 7% down to 173 FPS, and here the 12700 sat between the 5800X and 11900K, so not a bad result given the power limit. The Riftbreaker is a super CPU intensive game and a new addition to our battery of benchmarks. This one does heavily favour Alder Lake over Zen 3, and even Intel's 11th generation Rocket Lake parts perform really well. Again, the 12700 matched the 12700K, both with the H170i and RM1, while the power limit configuration was just 4% slower, matching the 11900K. And then when compared to Ryzen, the 12700 was 23% faster than the 5900X, so this isn't a great title for AMD, despite performance overall being acceptable. We find that in Hitman 3, the vanilla 12700 again matched the 12700K when cooled using the H170i, though the RM1 box cooler only dropped a few frames for what really was basically the same level of performance. Enabling the 65 watt spec dropped frames by 10% down to 189 FPS, and again that's the same level of performance seen from the 11900K. Moving on, we have Age of Empires 4, and this data can't be compared with the previous set of results from this game, as I'm using a completely different test scene, and of course resizable bar is now enabled for the Alder Lake and Zen 3 processors. In terms of performance, Alder Lake and Zen 3 are very similar, and with this being a mostly single core game, the 12700 performs much the same for all three test configurations. Frustratingly, Far Cry 6 is another single-core game, and this one really favours the strong single-core performance of the Alder Lake processors. Even with the 65 watt power limit, the 12700K was still 12% faster than the 5800X. And again, because this game is really only leaning heavily on a single core, the 12700K can still clock very aggressively within that 65 watt power budget. Horizon Zero Dawn also doesn't utilize the CPU that heavily, so the 65 watt spec still delivers great results here and allowed the 12700 to edge out the 11900K. Although Ryzen does take the cake on this one, the 12700 was just 6% slower, matching the 12700K. Last up, we have Cyberpunk 2077, which, despite the dialed down quality settings, is still mostly GPU limited with these higher end CPUs, the Ryzen 7 3700X excluded. Power limiting the 12700 did reduce performance here by 8%, making it slower than even the Core i7 10700K, but without any limits it did match the 5900X and was just a few frames slower than the 12700K. Now before jumping into the 10 game average data, here's a quick look at total system power consumption when running our Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark. Again, the RM1 increases total system usage, and this is due to the CPU heating up the VRM, causing it to run less efficiently. But with a good cooler, the 12700 matched the 5800X and 10700K for power usage, and then when power limited, matched the 3700X. So a solid result there given the performance. Finally, here's a look at the 10 game average data, and as expected, the 12700 without any power limits is right there with the unlocked K version, making it a smidgen faster than the Ryzen 9 5900X. Then, with the 65 watt spec enforced, the 12700 averaged 200 FPS, placing it on par with the 5800X and just 2.5% slower than the 5900X. It was also impressive to see that with the 65 watt limit in place, the 12700 was still 5% faster than the 11900K. Moving on, another new component we have from Intel is the laminar RM1 box cooler. The There's also a larger RH1 version that comes with the locked Core i9 parts, and then a more basic RS1 version that comes bundled with the Pentium and Celeron parts. They're all technically 65-watt coolers, so the RM1 is designed to work with the 12700 only when using the 65-watt spec. In terms of heatsink design, the RM1 isn't that different to past box coolers that featured the copper slug. That said, the copper slug is much bigger, and this helps take the overall weight from 226 grams to 346 grams, so a massive 53% increase in weight there. The cooler also looks better and features a more robust mounting system. So overall, a much better product, but again, it is only rated for 65 watts, so don't expect anything amazing. And here's a look at the cooling performance using the RM1 box cooler at the 65-watt spec on the 12700. In a 21-degree room with the components installed inside the Corsair 500D with the doors closed, we're looking at a 76-degree operating temperature under an all-core workload in Cinebench R23, looped for an hour, so that is a respectable result. With the power limits removed, the CPU core temperature quickly hits 100 degrees, and this introduces thermal throttling, and the amount of frequency that's taken out of the CPU cores will depend on the workload. And of course, we have already looked at application and gaming performance when thermally limited using the RM1 cooler. So to avoid thermal throttling, a basic tower-style air cooler will suffice. And we're only looking at slightly more power draw than the Ryzen 9 5900X and quite a bit less than the Core i7-11700K, so cooling the 12700 is going to be very simple. Now at this point you've seen how the Core i7-12700 performs on the MSI B660M Mortar Wi-Fi DDR4, but how does the board perform? And I don't mean in terms of storage performance, USB or audio, but rather the all-important VRM. Was the board on the verge of cooking itself, or are you good to run anything right up to the 12900K on it? Well, to find out, I threw this board in our Corsair iQ7000X VRM test system and ran Cinebench R23 on a loop for an hour. For recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, reporting the peak rear PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a constant ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. Now, with the 12900K installed, the B660M mortar peaked at just 79 degrees, which is a great result, and it means that even in a 30-degree room, the peak PCB temperature will be well under 100 degrees, and typically you won't see VRM throttling introduced unless temperatures go over 100 degrees, with 125 degrees becoming dangerous. This result means the mortar isn't much hotter than entry-level Z690 boards and is worlds better than the ASRock Z690 Phantom Gaming 4, a board I purchased for testing but haven't yet covered in detail, so spoiler alert I guess. But in terms of performance, the mortar was able to get the most out of the 12900K after the hour-long stress test and was 7% faster than the ASRock Z690 Phantom Gaming 4, so a great result for what I'm expecting to be a mid-range B660 board. Okay, so that's a look at the new Intel Core i7-12700, MSI's B660M mortar, and the Intel RM1 cooler. The box cooler is certainly quite a big upgrade over what we've seen previously from Intel. Having said that, it doesn't make it anything particularly special, and I suspect that the vast majority of you will just throw this thing aside in favor of a much more capable cooler. Even a $20 tower-style cooler will be a big upgrade. So, the box cooler, it still kind of sucks, but for those of you running at the 65-watt spec, it does work, and compared to past Intel coolers, it doesn't look atrocious. And I suppose given its size, the size constraints that Intel are working with here, it is quite a decent solution. As I said, nice copper slug there. It is quite heavy, so it's rattling a lot, I just realized. But yeah, not a bad looking cooler, but again, probably not particularly appealing or that useful for most of you. The Core i7-12700, on the other hand, is extremely appealing and likely going to be a go-to option for many PC builders. At the time of putting this review together, I don't have any pricing information from Intel. In fact, it seems Intel's been on holidays for us during this release and basically provided zero support. In fact, they really did provide zero support. I didn't even get a CPU from them. So that's disappointing, but really not unusual for Intel. Their review program is just a complete mess, but it's been this way for as long as I can remember. Thankfully though, this content isn't about Intel's review program performance, but rather the performance of the Core i7-12700, so let's just move on. When fully unleashed with an aftermarket cooler, the 12700 was only around 7% slower than the 12700K in applications, so for those of you not interested in overclocking, that should make the 12700 a much better deal. Then, when it came to gaming, the 12700 and 12700K were, for the most part, indistinguishable. Again, the locked processor was at most 7% slower, but typically the margin was less than a few percent, and as we saw, overall, less than 1% separated them across the 10 games tested. So, in terms of value, the 12700 is going to make a lot more sense for those of you not interested in CPU overclocking. Speaking of pricing, as I've said, I've got no official word on suggested retail pricing from Intel, but if we look at the 11th gen 11700 series, we can make some estimations. The MSRP for the 11700K, for example, is $400 US. The 11700KF is $375, $320 for the 11700, and $300 for the 11700F. So the 11700 is 20% cheaper than the 11700K. Now, assuming that we'll see similar margins with the 12700K and 12700, that would place the 12700 at around $330 US at retail. But Intel might end up being less aggressive on pricing for this generation given its competitiveness. But assuming Intel does hit $330 US for the 12700 or maybe the 12700F, and boards like the B660M mortar can be had for around $170 US, that's a pretty exceptional $500 US package and less than what you'll be paying for just the Ryzen 9 5900X, which at present costs $540 US. Meanwhile, the 5800X is $370, so add $150 for a decent and comparable quality B550 motherboard, let's say. That combo comes out slightly more expensive for what really is an inferior package. So, will Intel be that aggressive on pricing? It's impossible to say right now, but we'll have some idea shortly after this content goes live, and we'll have a really good idea over the next few weeks. If one thing's for sure though, AMD is set to get obliterated in the value segment with these 13 new locked CPUs from Intel, assuming that the blue team can meet demand, and I expect the demand for these parts will be pretty high. Also assuming that B660 motherboards are priced competitively, so we'll have to wait and see on that one. But if they are, parts like the Core i5-12400F, they're going to be particularly deadly, and I can't wait to check that one out. I do have one ordered, so it shouldn't be too long before I can take a look at it. For now though, I'm keen to see what pricing and availability looks like, and not necessarily the 1,000 unit pricing that Intel has probably given by this point in time. I'll probably pin a comment with that information, but what they're retailing for. So that'll, hinge on availability and stuff like that. But we'll get a good picture of that over the next few weeks, and then we can make some firm recommendations. But for now, the Core i7-12700 and probably in particular the F variant look to be awesome value options for high-end gaming. So if you enjoyed this video, then please do hit the like button. You can subscribe for more content. As I said, more locked Intel CPU content coming up. I'll also be looking at some more B660 motherboards. May do some sort of value roundup there if pricing makes sense, which I'm really hoping it does. So yeah, make sure you are subscribed. Also, we have Floatplane and Patreon for those of you who want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness, so stuff like our exclusive Discord server for Hardware Unboxed community members. Tim and I do a live stream at the end of each month, Q&As, behind the scenes content, so a lot of cool stuff. If you're interested, check out Floatplane or Patreon. If not though, perfectly fine, and I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host Steve, see you next time.